Dear colleagues, Your Excellency, it's a great pleasure and honor for me to deliver this lecture here in Vatican, in your academy. And I'm sorry not to have enough time to prepare printing version. I will try to explain my theme ad hoc, but in English, not in Latin. So resurgence of imperialism and nationalism in the Russian society after 1990. Now when we see this terrible increase in nationalism, imperialism, aggression, which we see, which radiated from Russia, we both, you in Europe and we, people who understand reality in Russia, were shocked. For me, for example, all these events after invasion to Georgia in 2008 and annexation of Crimea was a terrible thing. I tried to do my best to explain our people that it was an awful solution of Mr. Putin and his circle. But the majority of Russian population supported greatly, as you remember, these events. And the world was shocked. Mrs. Merkel wrote at that time to Mr. Putin that you lost your connection with reality. So for today's European world, this activity was something absolutely obsolete, something abnormal in principle, and it's so. But we ought to remember that a century ago, this politics was absolutely normal. And this politics of imperialism and nationalism was the main base for the First World War, because all great powers, Central Powers, Entente Cordiale, were for imperial existence of their states and for ethnical struggle, for ethnical predominancy. You remember this idea of pan-Germanism, pan-Slavic idea, and another one. At that time, British Empire possessed 1/4 of the world. Russian Empire, 1/6 of the world. French Empire, about Republican Empire, about 1/8 of the world. So at that time, the situation was imperialistic in its pure sense and nationalistic. It's necessary to remember the mood of the main nations of Europe in the beginning of the First World War. French people hated Germans, Slavic people hated Germans, Germans hated Russians and supposed them Untermensch, etc. We ought to remember that after the First World War, both principles, new principle of world without imperialism and the old principle of imperial world were connected. In April 1919, in the 13th of April, you remember, in Allahabad in India, British forces killed about 1,000 of peaceful Indians. And it is interesting that General Dyer, who was a commander of these British troops, had received absolutely different characteristics. Mr. Churchill said that it was one of the most awful deeds of British Empire. But House of Lords supported General Dyer at that time. So, and when President Woodrow Wilson produced on the 8th of January 1918 his 14 positions, 14 items, 14 principles, European powers, Great Britain and France, were not very glad to read them, because their idea was to increase their empires in the Middle East and to annex some territories large territories of Ottoman Empire. It was after the First World War. And at least the conflict, you see this growth of Germany, Nazi Germany, Anschluss of Austria, Sudet crisis, and this Munich Agreement of 1938. All these things were the results of imperialist politics, not only by Germany, but also by European countries, England and France, because both Chamberlain and Daladier supported Mr. Hitler in Munich and agreed with unification of German nations, the principle of unification of German nation. As to speak about Soviet Union at that time, between two wars, the same, but even more, I suppose, sophisticated position. Formally, communists proclaimed the idea of internationalism, no nationalism at all, and anti-colonialist politics. But in practice, Soviet communists were nationalists and terrible nationalists. And after when Stalin changed his politics in approximately 1933, 1934, after the 17th Congress of Communist Party, he followed Hitler's example in building national ethnic-oriented Russian state. Even alphabets of non-Russian peoples were changed at that time to Cyrillic from Latin alphabet, for example, or from Mongol alphabet in Buryatia. Since Stalin himself was Georgian, he didn't change Georgian alphabet and Armenian with it, but it was the only two. This imperial mood was much deeper than the problem of alphabets, because one of the hands of communist politics was Comintern, so Communist International Activity. And this Comintern produced terroristic acts, tried to organize revolution, tried to organize some pro-communist movements all around the world. It was imperialistic politics. And the main idea is, yes, said Stalin, we are for the peace, but peace will be stable if all the world will be communist. And if you see on the coat of arms of the Soviet state, you see that there is globe with symbols of communist rule. Yes, so it's idea of all world communist empire, let us name things with its own words. So Russian people, I mean Russian, not only ethnically Russian, but people who lived in the Soviet Union, Russian people, they lived with this idea of war, of imperial increasing of their state. And this principle of war, a principle of aggression, principle of nationalism was very strong. After the Second World War, West European nations, shocked with two terrible wars, with Hiroshima, with Holocaust, they changed their brains, they changed their understanding of reality. They understood that imperial cause and nationalistic cause is terrible and suicidal. And they start absolutely different politics. And the main principle, you know, of this new politics was Christian one. And the organizers of New Europe were Christian politicians. Konrad Adenauer, De Gasperi, Schumann, and others. And, but in the part of Europe which turned to be communist occupied, I mean eastern part of Europe and the Soviet Union, this new mood did not develop. It was not developed because of very simple reason. Christian ideas were prohibited or were in the periphery of thinking, and communist ideology was dominated. And that is why from this moment, from the end of the Second World War, we see in Europe two different attitudes to reality. One, new mood in Western Europe. For example, the attitudes between former aggressors and losers, Germany and Italy, and former states who won the war, I mean Great Britain, France, were absolutely different after the Second World War if we compare it in the situation after the First World War. No contributions, no changes of borders, new plans for assistance to Germany, to Italy, and to other states of Europe. And in eastern part, change of borders, terrible contributions, shifts of population. So Eastern Europe continued to live, because of Soviet Union and Stalin, continued to live in this paradigm of pre-First World War situation. And of course, simple people who lived in Russia, they used to understand the reality in this system of values. It was not easy to change system of values in Western Europe. You know that the process of denazification practically was finished only in the end of 80s with unification of Germany. The discussion of historians in Germany about the Nazi past took place in the end of 80s. And it was a difficult process. And in eastern part of Europe, this process even never started. It's necessary to understand. So we were rather similar understanding of reality, and to say frankly, absolutely non-Christian, maybe a Nietzschean understanding of reality in the beginning of the 12th century. But after the Second World War, we have absolutely different understanding of reality. Former aggressive, nationalistic state of mind was turned to be marginal in Western Europe and continued to be dominant principle in the eastern part of Europe, in the Soviet Union, and in some way in communist occupied states, for example, in Yugoslavia, Serbian nationalism, and in some way Hungarian also. After the liberation, after the decline of communism in the end of 1980s, after the decline of communism, it was a mistakable, of course, but illusion. It was an illusion that the world turned to be absolutely new, that, as Fukuyama wrote, history was over. We see that Hegel is wrong again. History is not over. But what was in practice at that time? All post-communist nations, both in Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, all post-communist nations were very deeply inclined to turn to be West European nations, with West European level of life, with prosperity, with freedom, or personal freedom, to move, to read, to take information, and to many other, sometimes very simple things which they want to access, to possess. And that's why they forgot about nationalism and were in search of new reality. And as to speak about East European countries, they hated Russian communism. And they tried to do what they could to be with Europe. And that's why they accepted all European values as some necessary moment to be accepted themselves into Europe and NATO. For the Soviet Union, for Russian Federation, it turned to be, at first glance, clear that people forget about nationalism, about communism, about imperialism, but it's a wrong solution. Social investigations, even in 90s, show us a different picture. Yes, Gorbachev maybe stopped to be a communist nationalist. He proclaimed that the human values are higher than class values. Maybe Yeltsin also think in this paradigm. I know personally that he thinks in this paradigm of democracy, of multinational state. He was against imperialism, against reconstruction of Soviet Union, etc. But the majority of population was for this. Only 27% of Russian population in 1997 were ready to agree with borders of Russian federations. Another 3/4 of the population wanted, some of them wanted Ukraine, some Belarus, and about 1/3 of population wanted the total unification of the Soviet Union. And many people from this time up till now say that it was a very great mistake to give independence to East European countries without any payments. Though we know that there were some payments at that time, not for independence, of course, but from German government, from the United States. But simple people say that we ought to sell these countries. So you see, absolutely moral position. And it was, and I just a week ago, I had one seminar in Moscow, and Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia again says the same thing. So we see in 90s that with Communist Party of Russian Federation accepted this nationalistic and imperialistic direction totally. They accept Stalin more than Lenin, though Lenin also was an imperialist. But now the majority of people don't know about it. But Stalin was openly imperialistic thinking person, and it is, you know that today about 3/4, about 70% of Russian population supported Stalin and supposed that his rule was rather good than bad moment in the Russian history. It's awful, but it's a fact. And now we want to ask why. What it is now, were there any mistakes which resulted in this situation now? Because Mr. Putin, of course, when he annexed Crimea and started the war in eastern Ukraine, he very well understood that he would increase his popularity by these steps, and it was really so. Before 2014, the support of Putin declined. After 2014, it was increased, and about 87% supported the annexation of Crimea. Now situation changed. And why this nationalism and this imperialism was so strong in Russia? I think that in some way, this is an inevitable thing, because we had this tradition of post-Second World War refreshing of brains, which Western Europe had. But on the other hand, it was a mistake of our reformators, because at that time it was necessary to show people that a new democratic and pro-European cause gives them some benefits. For intellectuals, these benefits are evident. You see, it's a possibility to take information, possibility to publish their ideas, to go abroad, but the majority of Russian population never go abroad and write no philosophical treatise. So for them it was necessary to give something very material. And this is, of course, a restitution of property. In all East European countries, in one or another form, I know that in Poland in one form, in Czech Republic in another form, they were made restitution of property. Communists confiscated all property, post-communist regimes returned property to the people whose ancestors possessed it. In Russia, nothing like this was done. Never. Never. No one person received the property of their fathers. No one peasant, no one merchant, no one gentry person, nobody. And people, small circle of people took all communist property as their private property, privatization, but the absolute majority of people took nothing material from this decommunization, this liberation of after the 1991. It was the first and great mistake of a Russian post-communist government, I think. And nobody want to change something. And that's why these imperial and nationalistic ideas turned to be a compensation of frustration of population, because people lost their traditional state of life. They turned to live worse than before, without any real perspectives, positive perspectives. And now we see in some way the improvement of this situation, not by some sage politicians, but by the life itself. Because, and in some way, by the strong opposition of Europe and NATO against this aggressive Putin's politics. If you accepted this annexation of Crimea and war in Ukraine, you would see absolutely different world than now in Europe. But you were strong, and it's very good. Situation in Russia began to change. Economical difficulties because of sanctions produced, and because of absolute incapability of KGB elite to rule the country. They rule this country as their private property, and of course for people it's very unpleasant, produce a situation of real poorness of the people. Degradation, economical degradation of Russia now is terrible. Though Russia is one of the richest states by natural resources in the world, maybe the most rich, but the state of living of population, not only in money but also in all social system, is very low, is terribly low. Defense of people from crime is in awful position. Medical care is awful position. And people began to understand that Crimea and Ukraine and this imperialistic and nationalistic approach, which was so clearly presented by Putin in 1914, 1915, gave them nothing. And we see that support to Putin is declined step by step in last year and in this year. And but it's very interesting decline. It's not decline for some other leader, no. I think that the most brilliant result of this development is that Russian people don't want any leader anymore. They want to rule their country by themselves, by self-government, by business, independent business, and they turn to anti-KGB system terribly. Before, for example, in the beginning of this millennia, the majority of businessmen were absolutely ignorant about the communist past. Communist past is lost. Now we built a new country. Today, everybody understands that a communist system, not ideologically, but in totalitarian practices, re-emerged, and they want to demolish it. That's why I think that ethnical imperialism and nationalism now is in decline position in Russia, is a position of decline, is a position of regress, and if both of us in Europe, with a strong opposition to any acceptance of the fruits of aggression, and in Russia, where we try to continue the explanation to the people, the real situation and what to do in future to build a normal, not strong, not great, but normal, comfortable for people state. If we both continue in this approach, we will see Russia in the future, I suppose in the nearest future, in some 5 years, in some 7 years, a part of common Europe and a part of common civilized world. It's our hope and our political goal. Thank you.